All right, Chaver on Zoom, we're still good? Excellent. All right, I will say good morning. Good morning. Let us begin. Try to maximize our limited amount of time this morning to begin. But first of all, let's say for Mesilas Yesharim, so I recorded and posted the last year. It's on the WhatsApp group. If you're part of the WhatsApp group or on the podcast, it feels a little bit anticlimactic to finish off the Sefer with a recording and not live, but okay, HaKadosh Baruch Hu plans the world, right? Plans the world. So, in any event, we thank all of our sponsors this morning for this morning's share, to thank our Talmud Torah sponsors for the month of Adar, Stephen Terry Zin, for dedicating all the Sherman Drushos this month in memory of Terry's father, Tzvi Hirsch Ben Yosef HaKohen, to thank Paul and Kathy Pollack for dedicating all the Sherman Drushos this month in memory of Paul's grandparents, Zechariah Ben Zechariah and Dina Bas Pesach, to thank our week of learning sponsors, Moshe David and Chana Artman, for dedicating all the shiurim this week in commemoration of the 23rd yahrzeit of Moshe David's father, Fishel Beryl Ben Yitzchak Gershon Zichron Livracha, and to thank Dr. and Mrs. Gartenhouse for dedicating the week of learning in the schus of Refuah Shlema for Natan Ben Rivka. We hope that in the merit of our Talmud Torah, all of the Neshamos Sav and Aliyah, the families in Nechaman, all those who require a refuah should have one together with Kol Cholei Yisrael. And we'll see with that, let us begin. We are on, today's daf is Membeis 42. We are picking up on Membeis 13 lines down from the top. Baya Baye. So Baya's Falkash will say very interesting Shaila. Baya Baye. Nazir Shegileach V'shir Shtei Saros. So remember again, a Nazir goes ahead and cuts his hair, shaves his head, but leaves behind two hairs. So we already spoke about, again, in yesterday's daf, that leaving behind two hairs invalidates the hair cutting. Validates the hair cutting. So here's the case. A Nazir went ahead and shaved his head and left behind two hairs. Samach Rosho, then all of his hair grew back. The Chazar v'Gilchan, and then he went ahead and he cut them. Now we'll say, cut what? So this is actually an interesting case over here. If you take a look at the Rush, so the Rush understands over here the case is as follows. The Rush is in the left-hand margin, and the Rush says about 12 lines down. Nazir shegilach v'shir beisaros v'nimtza shloki mitzvas giluach. So obviously, if you leave behind two hairs, that indicates that what? So that shows you have not properly performed the mitzvah of head shaving. Therefore, again, simach rosho osan saros chazur v'tzimchu. So we'll say, see now what happens? Now the hair grows back. The chazur v'gilach osan beis saros sheshir b'giluach harishon. So we'll say this is interesting. According to the Rush, what's happening over here is as follows. Listen to the case. Nazir shaves his head, leaves two hairs. Invalid hair cutting, invalid hair shaving, right? Hair grows back. After the hair grows back, I will say, what does he do? He recuts, or he cuts the two that he left behind. He cuts the two that he left behind. Now the truth is, that's the way the Rush is understanding this over here. Osam beis saros sheshir b'giluach harishon miyar minan have gelach kol sarosav be'elu beisis galchos o dilma bepam rishona lo gilach kevin the shir beis saros. The Hashtanami Kevin the Samach Sarosho Lomikir Yilach. So we'll say, so what's the Shaila? What's the Shaila? The Shaila is like this. Maybe at the end of the day, has he affected a full hair cutting? Has he affected a full hair cutting? Well, technically, yes. In other words, he's cut all of his hair. He's just done it at two different intervals, right? In other words, the first time around, he cut all of his hair, minus two hairs. Second time around, he cut the two remaining hairs. So now kind of when you look at it in totality, he's cut all of the hair of his Naziros just at two different times. Or no, that's not called hair cutting for a Nazir. Hair cutting of a Nazir is a one-time event. So that's the Shaila. Nazir shegilach v'shir shtei saros. So first time around, he's cutting his hair. He left behind two hairs. Now I'll say, so that's part one. Now part two, Samach Rosho, Baruch Hashem, his hair grew back, the Chazar v'Gilchan. Now he went ahead and he cut the two hairs that he left over the first time. Mahu, what's the halacha? Mi ma'akvi olo. So we'll say, what's the halacha? What's the halacha? Is this an effective hair cutting or not? So the Gemara says as follows. So by Rava, so we'll say, so okay, that was Abaye's question. Rava asks a different question. By Rava, Nazir shegilach veheniach shtei saros. So listen to this case. So Rava says, what about the following situation? A Nazir who cut his hair, he left behind two hairs. left behind 2 hairs. So we'll say, so again, what's the halacha if you leave behind 2 hairs? What's the halacha? Invalid hair cutting. All right, now watch this. Vigilach achas, now then, after shaving his head, he realizes he left behind 2 hairs. He goes in and he shaves one of them, v'nashra achas, and one of them fell out. One of them fell out on its own, right? So cut one, fell out on its own. Mahu, what is the halacha? What is the halacha in such a situation like this? I will say, first of all, take a, what, I'm sorry? Okay, all right. I was waiting for someone to say it. Okay, good. Right? Let's listen to this. Go listen to this. Let's take a look at the Rush. So the Rush says as follows: Vigilach acha v'nisha achas mau mi amrinan kevin delo gilach ela echad lo kie misas giluach o dilma kevin de b'shah shehischal legaleach havu hayulo beis saros kie misas giluach. Shabbos say, what's the shaila over here? The shaila over here is like this. You see, when when Nazir goes out and shaves his head, he leaves behind 2 hairs, fine. So he's invalidated the shaving. So now he wants to go back and cut his hair. Shabbos say, so do we say that since at the time when he was ready to shave off the 2 remaining hairs, there were 2 hairs? What do 2 hairs represent? What do they represent? A unit of giluach. A unit of hair cutting. So since at the beginning of the second part of the process, there was a unit of giluach intact. Therefore, again, as long as at the start there were 2 hairs, even if subsequently one of them falls out, that's still called a valid act of hair cutting. Or do we say, no, at the end of the day, again, one of them fell out on its own, therefore you did not fulfill a proper mitzvah of giluach. To which the Gemara says, "Amali Ravachim edifti Ravina, Gileach Sarah kami ba'ilei." Are you asking a question of a person who cuts 1 hair at a time? So I'll say, if you go ahead and you're a Nazir and you cut 1 hair at a time, that is still a valid giluach. To which the Gemara says, Gilach Sarah kami ba'ilei l'Rava, elaima noshra achas v'gilach achas mahu. Rather, perhaps according to Rava, the better way to phrase the case is, what happens if, same case, he shaved his head, he left behind 2 hairs. We'll say now, we'll say, by the way, in the case of leaving behind 2 hairs, could be just a case of shogeg, right? He missed it. So now he's going back to rectify it. And now what happens? As he gets ready to go ahead and cut those last 2 hairs, one of them falls out, and he shaves the last one. So what's the halacha in this case? Amarlei, giluach inkan, ser inkan. To which he responded, it's impossible to do an effective act of hair cutting, and there is no significant amount of hair left. To which the Gemara says, oh, that's an inherently contradictory statement. Ser inkan, if there's not significant hair left, then what? Giluach yeshkan, then it should be effectively shaved, right? And vice versa. This is what it means to say. What it means to say is, in this case, where he shaved his head, left behind 2 hairs, the first one fell out, and now he wants to go ahead and shave the last one. Here's the problem. Even though, again, halacha lamaisa, there is no meaningful hair that is left, mitzvahs giluach inkan. There's also no mitzvah of shaving. In other words, what the Gemara is saying is like this. The mitzvah of giluach, the mitzvah of shaving the head of the Nazir, only applies when what? When there are 2 hairs. In other words, so if there's only 1 hair left, there's just no longer a mitzvah of giluach. So Rabbi say, so what do we do with all of these cases, both Abayi and Rava? So here's how the Rambam chooses to codify this. So this is in Parak Ches, Hilchos Naziros Halacha Zayin. Gileach v'hiniach shtei saros. Rabbi say, here's the case. So first of all, Rabbi say, if nothing else, the point also to take out of this is that halacha l'maisa, so leaving over 2 hairs invalidates the giluach. So listen how the Rambam codifies it. Gileach v'hiniach shtei saros, person cuts his hair, Nazir shaves his head, and he leaves behind 2 hairs. So here's the case. V'tzimeach rosho kulo. Now Rabbi say, he left over 2 hairs, and now his hair grew back. The chazer v'gilcho, Im osan shtei saros, and now the Rambam says, what happens? Now let's say the guy shaves his whole head again, right? He shaves his entire head again, including those. Now, by the way, he doesn't have to shave his whole head again, but he does. He shaves his whole head again, including those 2 leftover hairs from the first time. Oh, shegileach achas v'nashra achas, or Rabbi say with the two hairs that were left over, he cuts one of them fell out. Harei ze kiyem mitzas giluach. That's how I'm asking. Halacha l'mais it works. So Rabbi say what comes out according to the Rambam, the chiddush over here is that you could do giluach at two intervals. So if he shaves his head, leaves behind two hairs, right? Case number one is where his hair grew back, and then he shaved the whole thing again. Yotzei mitzvas giluach, right? Case number two, he shaves his head, leaves behind two hairs, realizes he left behind two hairs. Well, so what does he do? He cuts the first one. The second one falls out. Yotzei the mitzvah of giluach. So what's the chap according to Rambam? We'll say two things. Number one, that you could effectively fulfill the mitzvah of giluach at two intervals, right? Number two, I will say, is as long as when you're beginning the hair cutting, there are at least two hairs in existence, even if you cut one and the other one falls out, you still have the mitzvah of giluach, right? Since two were there at the time you began to cut, you're good to go. Conversely, nashra achas v'gileach achas in kan mitzvahs giluach. On the other hand, if halacha l'maisa, let's say he left behind two hairs, one of them fell out. Right now he left over two hairs. Now one of them fell out, and now supposed to say at that point, and now he shaved the other one. That is not the mitzvah of giluach. Why is it not the mitzvah of giluach? Because halacha l'maisa giluach requires by definition at least two intact hairs. So again, if you shave the first one and the second one fell out, that's the mitzvah of giluach. First one fell out and shaved the second one, that's not the mitzvah of giluach. So the takeaway is, if you're going to be a Nazir, use a mirror, right, and get all the hairs at once, right? That's takeaway number one. Number two, if you left over a minimum of two hairs, ultimately that invalidates the giluach. Number three, you could do giluach at two intervals. So if a Nazir shaves his head, leaves behind two hairs, and then reshaves his head, even after all the hair grew back, halacha l'maisa, again, you're yotzei the giluach. When you go back to do the giluach, again, if one of the hairs falls out, are you yotzei the mitzvah? What's the answer? It depends. What does it depend on? The order, right? In other words, if you shaved first, fell out second, works. Fell out first, shaved second, doesn't work. Good. I will say that's the Rambam. Mishnah. No, very interesting Mishnah. Nazir chofeif umefas face avalo sorek. So listen to this. A Nazir, if you look at the Rush, so the Rush says over here, Nazir chofeif, he says chofeif sa'arosav beneser ba'adama. Chofeif Rabosa means shampoos. As a Nazir is permitted to go ahead and shampoo his hair. Umefas face means to separate his hairs one from the other. So he could shampoo his hair, he could go ahead and separate his hair one from the other. Aval lo sorek, but he's not allowed to comb his hair. And I will say, now again, what's going on over here? Says the Gemara, chofeif umefas face money. Why is a Nazir permitted to go ahead and shampoo his hair and separate his hair? That's Rabbi Shimon. What does Rabbi Shimon hold? Rule says Rabbi Shimon from Shabbos, the Amr, davar she'eino miskaven moter. See, Rabbi say, what happens or what potentially happens when a person shampoos his hair, or what happens when a person goes ahead and separates his hair? Hairs come out. A Nazir is not permitted to pluck out a hair. So why is he permitted to shampoo and to separate his hair? Because Rabbi say the act of shampooing or separating is a davar she'eino miskaven, right? The intention of the Nazir is not to pluck out hairs, right? What's the intention of the Nazir? To shampoo, right? To clean, right? To clean or to disentangle. So if it turns out that a hair comes out, that's an unintended consequence, and therefore halacha l'maisa we pass like Rabbi Shimon that a davar, or at least over here, that a davar she'eino miskaven is mutter, right? Doing something with an unintended consequence, or performing an unintended balacha, ultimately again is going to be mutter. However, avalo sorek, but yet he can't comb his hair. Now we'll say, why can't he comb his hair? Asan l'Rabbanan. Now we'll say that goes according to the Rabbanan. Now we'll say, remember again, see, here's what's interesting. What's interesting is as follows. The Gemara is suggesting over here that halacha l'maisa, the Rabbanan hold that a davar she'eino miskaven is aser, right? Something with an right. In other words, even performing I keep using the word malacha, but over here not malacha by Shabbos, but even performing an act, right, that produces an unintended consequence is going to be asur. So therefore, the Rabbanon say you can't use a comb. To which the Gemara says, one second, Reish Rabbi Shimon Sefer Rabbanon. So the Reish is the first part of the Mishnah that you could shampoo and disentangle your hair is Rabbi Shimon, that a davar she'eino miskabin is mutter, and a Sefer that you can't use the comb is the Rabbanon. Amarabba, no. Kulu Rabbi Shimon. It's all Rabbi Shimon. If it's all Rabbi Shimon, what's going on over here? Kalasorek lahasir nemin miduldalos miskabin. Rabbi Shimon will say that the act of combing hair, by definition, will say, why do people comb their hair? In order to remove dangling hairs. Or as part of the act of combing part of the grooming of combing is going ahead and removing stray hairs. So because that's the kavanah with the act of grooming, even Rabbi Shimon, who says that a davar she'eino miskabin is mutter, will hold that what? The kavanah of combing is to remove hair. Now, I both say the truth is the Rosh makes a simpler distinction. The Rosh says, what's the distinction between shampooing, separating, and combing? Rosh holds that combing is a psik resha, which is kind of, it sounds like what the Gemara is ultimately answering, right? That at the end of the day, that the kavanah when it comes to combing is to remove stray hairs, and therefore halacha l'maisa the Nazir can't do it. Good. So we'll say, so that's the bottom line from the sugya. Nazir could shampoo his hair. Nazir could go ahead and disentangle his hair, but he cannot use a comb because a comb will be why? Because shampooing, disentangling, davar she'eino miskavein, but use of a comb, psik resha. Beautiful. Says the Mishnah. Continuing on this same theme. Rabbi Shmuel says, Rabbi Shmuel says, Lo yachov ba'adama, Nazir should not shampoo his hair with adama. And I will say, now apparently, they used to use certain types of earth as shampoo. So a Nazir cannot go ahead and shampoo his hair with earth, because ultimately, again, it causes hair to come out. Okay? So I will say, so we'll have to see again how this stems with what we just said before, because we just said before in the previous Mishnah that you can go ahead and shampoo your hair with earth. Or you can shampoo, I should say. Says the Gemara. So let's analyze this. So I'll say, how should you read the Mishnah? Should you read the Mishnah as Rabbi Shmuel says, you cannot shampoo with earth, because earth by definition removes hair. Or maybe I will say the way to read the Mishnah is, you can't shampoo with certain types of earth. Why? Because those types of earth remove hair. In other words, are we saying that all types of earth shampoo remove hair? Or no, there are types of earth shampoo which remove hair. So what's the difference? Here we go. Kigon diika adama de lo masra. So I will say, let's say you know that there's a type of earth shampoo that does not remove hair. So watch this. So I'll say, if you say you can't shampoo with earth because earth goes in and removes hair, so if that's the case, then you should be permitted to go ahead and what? Use earth that doesn't remove hair. But if you say it's lest you come, if you say you can't shampoo with earth because of earth that can remove hair, then I will say that would essentially create what? A blanket prohibition against using all types of earth for shampoo, lest you come to use the type of earth which removes hair. To which the Gemara says, Teku. So the Gemara leaves off unanswered. The Gemara say, the Rambam Paskins in Hilchos Naziros, Parakeh Halacha Dalid. Here we go. Nazir, so first of all, the Rambam goes through this whole sugya. And the Rambam writes, Nazir chofef al sa'aro biyado. So if we'll say, v'chochech b'tzi parnav. So we'll say, so a Nazir is permitted to disentangle his hair with his hand and with his nails. V'im nafal se'ar eino choshesh, shehare ein kavanoso lahashir ve'afshar shlo yasir. So we'll say, and if hair comes out, it's not a big deal. Why is it not a big deal? Because it's a davar she'eino miskabin. Right? That's not his intention. It's not his intention. Aval lo yisrog b'masreik. I will say, but he cannot comb his hair. Nazir can't comb his hair. Right? V'lo yachov ba'adama. nor can he shampoo with earth. Why? Mipnei shamasheres es hasear vadai. Because at the end of the day, shampooing, Rabbi say, will do what? Shampooing definitely goes, or I should say, shampooing with earth definitely removes hair. The masakain, okay, but if he did so, he doesn't get malchus. Fine. So Rabbi says that's the Rambam Paskins. Ultimately, again, shampooing is fine, but apparently without earth, right? Disentangling is fine, right? Combing is not fine, and the use of earth for shampoo is not fine as well. Good. Mishnah, I'll say, Bada Mishnah, Mem Beis Amadalef. Nazir, Shahaya Shosi Yain Kalayom. If you had a Nazir who is drinking wine the whole day, I'll say, by the way, what an apropos Gemara, right? Tanis Esther, incredible. Erev Purim, absolutely incredible. So the Nazir goes in and drinks wine the entire day. Eino chayiv ela achos. He's only going to be chayiv once. Only chayiv once. So we'll say, this is incredibly important. Nazir goes ahead and drinks wine the entire day. There's only one liability. So Amrullah, however, if they said to him, al tishta, vushosa, but I will say, if they repeat to him, don't drink. I will say, now what does it mean they repeat to him, don't drink? What is talking about a case of multiple hasros? Remember, again, I will say, in general, there is only liability for a particular act if a person first receives hasra, a proper halachic warning that what they are doing is prohibited and what they are doing carries with it a particular penalty. So again, what the Gemara is saying is like this: if the Nazir drinks wine throughout the day, but that prolonged act was only preceded by one hasra, there's only one liability. But if he's drinking throughout the day and at different intervals, he's receiving a hasra, then halacha l'maisa, he's going to be chayiv for each individual act preceded by a hasra. So the Gemara says, similarly, if he's cutting his hair the whole day, he's only going to be chayiv once. But I will say, if they say to him, don't cut your hair, don't cut hers, they give him individual hasros, but he continues to go ahead and cut his hair, chayiv al kol achas v'achas. He'll be chayiv each time. I will say, now what I want to point out to you is something very interesting, and this is probably so the chiddush of I will say is, imagine the Nazir is engaging in one prolonged contiguous act. So what it's saying is, if during that contiguous act, he's warned multiple times, there's individual liability for each of those acts. That's the chiddush over here. That's the chiddush. Even though it's one contiguous act, as opposed to if there's one asra with one contiguous act, he's chayiv once. One contiguous act with multiple hasraos peppered in there, he's going to be chayiv multiple times. Similarly, again, if he's becoming tummy to the dead the entire day, he's going in and out of the cemetery the whole day, or touching corpses the whole day. So what's the halacha? Eino chayiv ela achos. He's only going to be chayiv once, right? However, same case. Amar lo al tetame v'hu metame. But if they keep saying to him, don't become tame, and what? He becomes tame. Chayiv al kol achas v'achas. He will be chayiv ultimately again for each act of Tumah. So we'll say, again, same principle, just explained again in three different contexts of drinking wine, hair cutting, and Tumas Mei. So we'll say, let's analyze. Itmar, Amar Rabba, Amar Rav Huna, Mikra Male Diber HaKosov. So we'll say, it's very interesting, Gemara. So ultimately, again, let's analyze this. So Rabba says, name Rav Huna, the following, that I will say that this concept, that a Nazir could be liable for multiple acts of Tumah. Now I will say, I just want to point out to you something very interesting. What's the chiddush, specifically in Tumah? What's the chiddush in saying that a Nazir could be chayiv multiple times for Tumah? What's the chiddush? The chiddush is, I will say, that once you're tameh, then what? You're tameh. You're tameh. In other words, I hear it by the act of wine consumption, because each act of wine consumption is an additional act. Even hair cutting, I will say, right? If he's cutting his hair throughout the day, again, he's cutting a little more. There's something substantively that's being done. What's fascinating, and this is what really the Gemara picks up on, is the case of Tumah. Because in the case of Tumah, once you're Tameh, you're Tameh. In other words, Bepashtos, once you're Tameh, let's play this out, right? Nazir walks into a cemetery. He's Tameh. he goes back out, he walks back in. Has anything else additional happened to him? The pashtus no. In other words, he's tamei tumas meis. There's no like, now you're more tamei, now you're less tamei. So we'll say, the chiddush over here is, if he's becoming tamei the entire day, and we give him multiple asras, then halacha l'maisa, he's chay. Well, we'll see halacha l'maisa, but for our purpose right now, halacha is going to the Mishnah, he's chay for each of those acts of tumah. So comes along Rabba says in the Rav Huna, mikra male diber hakasav. This concept ultimately again is a mefurish pasuk. Now take a look at Rashi for just a moment. Rashi says over here, left-hand column, mikra male diber hakasav benazir lo yitam lebamosam lasiro ala tumah. Ukishechazer va'amar kol yimei hiziro la'Hashem al kol nafshos meis lo yavo chazer v'yizhiro al bias ohel shebo meis lomar lecha shenitma b'meis v'chazer v'niknas ba'ol sheyish b'meis chayiv shtayim. Shabo say essentially what we're going to see is as follows. Well, let's take a look now. Rabbi comes along and says in Rav Huna, the way that the psukim are structured by Nazir are dafka to teach you that if the Nazir became tamei and then he becomes tamei again, there's enhanced or increased liability. Watch this. So the pasuk says, lo yitama, right? So now remember, let me give you the whole pasuk. The pasuk lo aviv uli imo lo ach v'lachosa lo yitama lahem b'mosam ki nezer elokav al rosho. Remember again, a nazir like the Kohen Gadol cannot become tamei even for immediate relatives. It's an incredible idea, right? So even his immediate relatives pass away, the Nazir is not permitted to become tamei for them. So lo yitama. So the pasuk says he can't become tamei. Kishu omer lo yavo. Now in addition to that, the Torah says, kol yimei hiziro la'Hashem al nafsho meis lo yavo. So it says lo yitama, and it says lo yavo. So we'll say, so what's the pshat? La asira ala tuma, la asira ala bia, aval tuma vituma lo. So Rabbi said this is very interesting. So Rabbi says in the name of Rav Huna, what is coming to teach us is as follows: that halacha l'maisa, a nazir will be chayiv for tuma. Rabbi say, what does tuma mean? Tuma means either, right? Tuma means either entering into, let's say, a cemetery. Tuma can mean touching a corpse. But Rabbi say, so what the Torah is coming to say is there's additional liability if after that he comes into an ohel mace. Now, what's the chab of ohel? Tumas all means you're under the same roof as a corpse, even though there's no contact being under the same corpse. So according to Rabbi and Rav Huna, if he first has contact and then ohel, ultimately again there'll be enhanced liability. But Rabbi says, listen to this. But Rabbi says, halacha l'maisa, but multiple forms of the same tumah do not add on to one another. So Rabbi says, I just want to point out something very interesting over here is as follows. According to Rav Huna, we're going to see this machlokes in Rav Huna, but according to Rabba's interpretation of Rav Huna, watch this. If a Nazir goes into a cemetery, okay, what's his status? Tamei. If after that he enters into a house, he's under the same roof with a corpse, then what? Additional liability. Rabbi say, now watch this. According to Rabba's and Rav Huna, if a Nazir goes to a cemetery, walks out, and goes back in, what's the halacha? There's no additional liability. That's what we call tumah v'tumah. No additional liability. Why? Because in other words, the only time there's additional liability is when there's ohel and contact, what we'll call tumah and ohel. Why? Because the Torah itself says lo yitama and lo yavo. The fact that the Torah phrases two different prohibitions by the Nazir says those could add on to each other. But in terms of adding on like prohibitions of tumah, no. We'll say now Rabba's logic is very sound. What's Rabba's logic? Is you've done nothing. In other words, if the Nazir goes into the cemetery, goes out and goes back in, you haven't done anything. So because you haven't done anything, therefore what? Therefore no enhanced liability. Now watch this. Rabbi Yosef says, Ha'elokim, right? Now Ha'elokim is a lashon of a shvua, right? So that means like Rabbi Yosef feels very passionately about this. Amar Rav Huna, afilu tumah v'tumah. So Rav Yosef disagrees with Rabbi. Rav Yosef says, Rabbi, you're wrong. Now both say, this is a machlokes, in the position of Rav Huna. So Rabba's understanding of Rav Huna is the only time, according to Rav Huna, that you could have multiple liabilities for Tumah is when there are different types of Tumah. Namely, let's say when first time there's contact with Tumah, it goes into a cemetery, and second time there's Tumas Ohel. And that's because the Torah itself phrases it as Lo Yitama and Lo Yavo. But if you have multiple acts of entering into the cemetery, Rabba's understanding of Rav Huna is that there will not be liability for multiple tumas of the same type. Comes along Rav Yosef and he says, by God, Rabba, you are wrong. Rav Huna holds afilu tuma v'tuma. Rav Huna holds, Rabbi say, even repeated acts of the same type of tuma will in fact generate liability. Where do we know this? Rabbi say, listen to this. The Amar Rav Huna, listen to this case. Nazir, Shaya Beis Akvaras. Suppose here's the case. A Nazir was standing in the cemetery. Voshito lo meso umes acher. And Rabbi say, now what happens? They hand him a corpse, right? He's standing in the cemetery, and they hand him a corpse. Whether it's a corpse, his own relative, umes acher, or someone else's, or another corpse, v'nagabo. And ultimately, again, he touches this other corpse. What's the halacha? Chayiv. He's going to be chayiv. Now, say, now what is this a case of? Now watch this. Remember, where's the Nazir? Standing in the cemetery. Now we'll say, then what? So he's standing in the cemetery. Therefore, what's his status? Tameh. Now what happens? They hand him a corpse. I will say, when they hand him a corpse, it means it's like he touches a corpse. That's the chab of this. He touches a corpse. Now I will say, what happens when he touches a corpse? Okay, now I will say, from a status perspective, does anything change in the Nazir from after touching the corpse? Same thing. Yet again, the Brisa says that he is chayiv, right? Rav Huna says that he is chayiv. Amai ha mitame v'kayim. Now, one second, why should the Nazir be chayiv? After all, again, he's already tameh. Why is he already tameh? Because he's standing in the cemetery. Elalav shmamina amrav Huna afilu tuma v'tuma. Rather, Rabbi say, what do you see from here? That according to Rav Huna, even what we call tuma v'tuma, even additional forms of the same type of tumah will still create additional liability. I will say, if you take a look at the Rush for just a moment, the Rush, I will say, it's like probably about 15 lines in. Rav Yosef Amar afilu tumah v'tumah af below tosefes tumah mischayiv shtayim. So Rabbi say, I just want to point out what a fascinating yesodistic machlokes we have over here. So Rabbi say, so what we have over here is a machlokes Rabba and Rav Yosef in the position of Rav Huna. So remember again, Rabba's going to say the only time there's liability for additional tumah is when it's a different type of tumah. So if let's say you have, let's call it regular tumah. What we call tumah means either direct contact with a corpse or you're standing in a cemetery. So if you're tameh and then you enter into an ohel with a mace, then you'll have additional liability. But aside from that, multiple tumas of the same type will not generate liabilities. Therefore, I will say, according to Rabba's understanding of Rav Huna, watch this. You're in a cemetery, right? You're a Nazir. You walk into a cemetery, right? You walk out, you walk back in. You walk out, you walk back in. What's the halacha? How many times do you chayiv? Once. Comes along Rav Yosef. Rav Yosef disagrees. And I will say, by the way, Rav Yosef has a pretty strong leg to stand on because he is quoting a statement of Rav Huna. And Rav Huna says, a Nazir is standing in a cemetery. And I will say, what happens? Right? So what happens when he stands in a cemetery? You're tameh. Then what happens? He touches a corpse while he's in the cemetery. What's the halacha? Rav Huna says, chayiv twice. Why? Ultimately, again, tuma v'tuma. Because Rav Yosef posits that Rav Huna holds that there is multiple liability for increase of tuma, even with the same type of tuma. All right, so let's analyze. Abaye raises a kasha. So listen to this. Kohen shahaya lo meis munach al ksefo. Now we'll say, here's the case. A Kohen has a corpse on his shoulder. Voshito lo mesa umes achar. So we'll say, so now here's the case, right? So the Kohen is mamish holding a corpse. He has a corpse on his shoulder. Now we'll say, as he's holding the corpse on the shoulder, what happens? Someone extends another corpse to him, which means he touches he touches. It's a heavy day, right? It's a heavy day. So, so the Kohen is holding a corpse on his shoulders, and meanwhile, somebody extends another dead body towards him, and he touches the other dead body. You might have thought the Kohen should ultimately again be chayiv for the second act of touching the corpse, to which the Gemara says, Talmud Lomar, v'lo yichalel. We'll say the pasuk says a Kohen should not profane his kahuna kite, right? In other words, he shouldn't come in contact with the dead. So the Gemara says, what does that refer to? B'misha ino mechulol. So I'll say that refers to a Kohen who is not profaned. Yatzazeh shehu mechulol v'omed. This comes to exclude a case of what? A Kohen who is already, quote unquote, profaned. Now we'll say, now what does that mean, a Kohen who's already profaned? In other words, we'll say, what do we seem to be saying over here? The Kohen is holding a corpse on his shoulders, right? So he's already holding a dead body, which means that what? He's already tameh. Abaye says, what is the Brisa saying? What is the Brisa saying? That if he touches another corpse, there's no additional liability. Why is there no additional liability? Because we'll say, the prohibition for a Kohen is to make himself tameh. Well, once he's already tameh, then exposing himself or touching additional tumah does not go ahead and do anything. So I will say this seems to be a question against who? Against Rav Yosef and a support of Rabbah. To which the Gemara says, Amar le'eh. So Rav Yosef will say, 1 second. So first of all, Yosef says, well, what Abaye? What are you going to do with our Mishnah? Because after all, what did the Mishnah say? This nan hayom mitame le'meisim kol hayom. Eino chayiv ela achos. Yet I will say again, look at our Mishnah. What did our Mishnah say? If the Nazir is becoming tamei the entire day, right, and he only had one hasra, he's going to be chayiv once. Amru lo al tetame al tetame. But I will say, if they say to him, they give him multiple asras, don't become tamei, don't become tamei. What's the halacha? Chayiv al kol achos va'achos. He's going to be chayiv for every single act of tumah. But 1 second, Abai, based on what you said, va'amai ha mitame v'kaim. 1 second. Why should he be chai multiple times? Once he's tamei, is tamei. So I'll say elakasha adadi. So I'll say. So the truth is, we have really a machlokes, a contradiction between the brisa and between our Mishnah. In other words, I will say, remember again. Here's what we have. I have a brisa by the kahuna. What does the brisa by the kahuna say? The Kohen is holding a dead body on his shoulder. He's carrying a dead body, right? And so therefore, what? We'll say, what's the status? He's carrying a dead body. Tamei. Now what happens? Someone goes ahead. Essentially now the Kohen touches a second corpse. So Rabbi say, what's the halacha when he touches a second corpse? There's no liability for that second act of tumah, which sounds like a support to Rabba's interpretation of Rav Yosef, that there is no tumah v'tumah. Once you're tameh, and there's no additional liability for additional tumah. Rabbi say, so now comes along Rav Yosef, and Rav Yosef says, 1 second, how does that stem with our Mishnah? Because what did our Mishnah say? The Nazir is going in and out of the cemetery, So we'll say, what's the halacha? If there's only one hasra, then what? He's chayiv once. But if there are multiple hasras, he's going to be chayiv for each act of tumah, which indicates to us what? Yesh tumah v'tumah. There is liability for additional tumah, even of the same type of tumah. So we'll say, how do we reconcile the Mishnah and the Brisa? So this is incredible. Lo kasha, kan b'chiburin, kan shelo b'chiburin. So I'll say this is absolutely fascinating. The Gemara wants to suggest that this is a case of chiburin. Now I will say, what's the case of chiburin? If you take a look in the rush, so I will say, I don't know, at least in my rush, if you see where Tosas my shna is, right across from Tosas my shna, it's there in the rush. Lo kashe kan b'chiburin, kan shelo b'chiburin. Now watch this. I will say, Abaye heishev l'Rav Yosef l'taritz habrayse v'Mishnah. So the Bryce is talking about a case where, remember what? The Kohen is holding the corpse, right? Remember again, the case, remember the Bryce's case? Kohen's holding the corpse, and then what happens? He touches a second corpse. So what's the halacha in that case? The Bryce has said, there's no additional liability. So watch this. So he says, "Kam b'chiburin ba'odo mechuber lameis imoshito lo meis lo mechayiv the mechulo va'ometu ve'ena mosif tuma al tumaso." Shabbos say this is fascinating. This is right. It makes so much sense. What's it saying? In the Bryce's case, a Kohen is holding a corpse. We'll call it corpse one. Then what happens, Rabbi say? He touches corpse 2. So the Bryce says, in that case, there's no additional liability. Now I will say, I'll tell you why. It makes sense. Because since he's actively holding tumah, it doesn't make sense to say that the second act of contact will generate any additional liability. Conversely, kan shelo b'chibure achar shepirish min hameis v'hoshit lo meis achar v'hisru bo al tetame chayiv. See, Rabbi say, the case on the other hand in the Mishnah must be where what? Where the Nazir is tameh, not tameh. In other words, Rabbi say, for example, he's in the cemetery, goes out of the cemetery. In the cemetery, out of the cemetery. That's the case where there could be multiple liabilities ultimately for Tumah. So I would say a fascinating distinction over here, that when you are actively connected to the source of Tumah, Abayi wants to suggest everyone will agree Ein tumah v'tumah, right? There's no additional layers of tumah. You can only be chay. You're only chay once because you are in an active state of tumah. Masha'ein kain, on the other hand, if you separate yourself from the tumah, there could be then additional liability for enhanced tumah or for additional tumah afterwards. So you hear the distinction? That's why in the Bryce's case, where the Kohen is actively holding on to the corpse, then when he touches the second corpse, there's no additional liability because he's mechubar. He's still attached to the initial source of tumah. So it makes sense if you're attached to the initial source of tumah, there's no liability for additional tumah. The case of the Mishnah must be the Nazir was in the cemetery, then he left the cemetery. Now if he gets hasra again, he could be chayiv again for a second act of tumah. To which the Gemara says, V'tumah b'chiburin da'araisa. Shabbos says, is that true that tumah, that the concept of chiburin, which means the concept ultimately again of being attached to tumah, is a din da'araisa? Hamra v'yitzchak bar Yosef and Rabbi Yanai lo amra tumah b'chiburin el l'truma v'kadshim. Shabbos says, yet we learned that the concept of chiburin by tumah only applies to Truma and Kachim, aval Nazir va'oseh Pesach lo. But ultimately, it doesn't apply in cases of Nazir, and it doesn't apply in cases of Karban Pesach. In other words, it wouldn't preclude you from going ahead and eating Karban Pesach. V'i amrit da'oraisa maishna. But I will say again, if you say that it's a din da'oraisa, then why should there be any distinction? It should apply in all cases. To which the Gemara says it's not a contradiction. Kan bichiburi adam. Kan bichiburi adam b'mei. So I'll say this is actually absolutely fascinating. So I'll say take a look at the Rush once more. Look at the Rush once more. I will say so. This is the Rush again in my version of the Rush. This is towards the bottom, 5 lines up from the bottom. Listen to this fascinating distinction. Kan bichiburi adam. Kan bichiburi adam b'meis. Ruvain shenaga b'shimin ba'od Shimon nogea b'meis tamei zayin min haTorah. So we'll say listen to this. Listen to this, I will say. So now, halacha l'maisa, if Ruvain touched Shimon, and Shimon was touching a corpse. Okay? So Ruvain touches Shimon is touching a corpse. So mid'araisa, that makes Ruvain biblically tameh, which means now that for Tumah he has to go ahead and observe, 7 days. Right? Aval Ruvain, Shenaga b'Shimon, v'Shimon b'Levi, v'Levi b'Meis, Tamei Tumas Erev min haTorah midrabanan Tumas Erev. Well, so listen to this. But if Ruvain's touching Shimon's touching Levi, Levi's touching a corpse, so then watch this, then Ruvain, the first guy, right, ultimately mid'araisa, is only tamei for 1 day. But ultimately, again, midrabanan is going to be chayiv 7 days. So we'll say what we're going to do is actually we're going to stop over here for today. We're going to stop. I read that last part quickly. We're going to pick up with this again. But I'll say what we're ending off with, effectively, what we're ending off with today is the concept of Gemara introducing us to the concept of chiburin and floating the following idea. That maybe, if you are actively attached to the source of tumah, everyone will agree. Ein tumah v'tumah. There's no such thing as additional liability for more forms of tumah. But perhaps if you're tameh, but disattached from the source of tumah, even though what? I will say, if you're tameh and you disattach from the source of tumah, what's your status? You're still tameh. But maybe if you're detached from the source of Tumah, that would allow for the ability for additional layers of Tumah liability. Ibn Yetzer will say, to be continued tomorrow, Shkoyach.